Now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Matthew Dickerson is here to tell us about his experience as artist in residence at Glacier National Park. And we have, he's the author of numerous books, and we're very pleased to be that the Vermont Bookshop is here, Jenny Lyons is here to sell copies of them, including his latest book, which is The Voices of Rivers, which is set in Glacier National Park as well. So please welcome Matthew Dickerson.
Well, thank you for coming. I was, like I said, I had a chance to be artist in residence. I was selected as artist in residence 2 years ago at Glacier National Park. So I got to spend the month of June in a little cabin on a lake. And mostly I'm just going to tell you some stories about my time at the park. And at the end, I hope to read a little section of my new book. It's actually, I think, not officially released for like 9 or 10 more days, but we were able to get some early copies. I'm going to be telling some stories about fish, and some beautiful, brightly colored fish. And the fish I'm going to tell you about are very important fish to ecosystems. They are fish that live most of their adult lives in very large bodies of water, growing big, filling up on nutrients, then swimming up lots of small rivers and little streams and spreading out those nutrients all through the ecosystem, feeding the forests and feeding the plants and feeding the birds and feeding the eagles and actually feeding some other creatures. And all the photos and video I'll show today are ones that I took. You can see these grizzly bears trying to get some meals from the large numbers of these the fish swimming up the river here. This one in particular is, I think, almost ADHD. There's so many. He can't actually decide which one to go after, and he'll start after one, and there's so many in the river that he'll be like 2 or 3 feet away from catching one, and another one will swim by, and he'll turn around and change his mind and go after the other one. Finally, the slightly younger one, the less dominant one, gets so impatient, waiting for a chance to fish, because the bigger one won't let him in, that eventually the bigger one turns his back, and the littler one decides, I'm tired of waiting, and it takes him about 4 seconds to catch a fish. And you watch this, okay? This is a slightly less dominant fish, like 1001, 1002, 1003, boom, he's got one. And actually the most disappointing moment of this trip was I shut the video off about 5 seconds too early, because now the big bully, wanting to steal the lunch money from the little kid, chases after him and takes that salmon away, which may have been the point of that whole exercise. Like, just let the little one come in, catch the fish that I can't catch, and then I'll come and take it away. Now, those of you who know your fish may actually have been wondering, now wait a minute, I thought this talk was on Glacier National Park. And those fish we are looking at were actually sockeye salmon, which are not native to Glacier National Park. And although those are brown bears, which are the same species as the grizzly bears of Glacier National Park, they actually aren't grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are only the name we give to inland brown bears. These are coastal brown bears. That scene was about 90 miles away from the ocean, so those sockeye salmon had spawned 90 miles up this river, up above the timberline in Katmai National Park. But it turns out that the story that those pictures give you connect to Glacier National Park in a couple ways and provide a nice introduction. The story that we are all familiar with in Alaska of the whole ecosystem being built around these salmon, which, depending on the species, live 2 to 6 years in the ocean, fattening up and then swimming by the hundreds of millions up into these rivers and spreading those nutrients all over the ecosystem. Or actually, the salmon don't spread their nutrients, but all the predators that eat the salmon spread the nutrients all over the environment, so that trees within 2 miles of a river will grow twice as fast as other trees because of the nitrogen. That same story takes place in the Rockies, but it's a much less familiar tale, but an equally important one to the ecosystem of the Rockies. And then the other connection that we'll get back to is, although those sockeye salmon are not native in the Rockies in Glacier National Park, it turns out they also play an important part of the story that I'm going to tell. So let's now turn away from Alaska, and we will turn to Glacier National Park, just to give you a little background of where we are. This is the world. There's Montana, and there's one point in the middle of Glacier National Park. It's a very interesting point. It's called Triple Divide Peak, and it gets the name because that is the single unique point in North America at the heart of Glacier National Park, that it is part of, it's the watershed of 3 different oceans. So water flowing off the north side of that will end up in Hudson Bay in the Arctic. Water flowing off the southeast side of that will end up eventually in the Missouri River and down in the Gulf of Mexico in the Atlantic. And water flowing off the southwest side of that will end up in the Columbia River Basin and out in the Pacific. So that's the unique triple divide in our continent. What that also means is that it's a tremendously rich ecosystem in Glacier National Park. So 2 things. One, because those rivers are the paths by which animals migrated as the last ice age ended, you have species coming up from all 3 watersheds to inhabit this land of Glacier National Park. So a tremendously diverse ecosystem. But in the other direction, that water flows down out of Glacier National Park and impacts all 3 of those water systems. So what we do and how we protect the land of Glacier National Park essentially impacts the whole continent, because that's where these waters flow. So the first place I want to bring you in my story is this place, and my story will continue, as I told you. What we saw in Alaska with the sockeye salmon swimming up from the ocean, that same thing is happening in Glacier National Park and throughout the Rockies. These are not sockeye salmon, but these are native westslope cutthroat trout, which are actually at the heart of the ecosystem of many places in the Rockies. This little pond I discovered with the help of my very first day there, and if you look in it, again through the murky water, the density of those trout is phenomenal. This is not a fish hatchery. It looks like a scene you might get if you wandered down to the Salisbury hatchery and put your camera in the water, that density of trout, but this is a natural scene, a natural setting. About a 2 or a mile and 3/4 hike up in from a dirt road to find this pond and drop my camera into the water and get pictures of these fish. So before we jump to Glacier, let me just tell you one other story, and I think this video will help you imagine. If you look at the density of this fish, it will help you imagine that. Cutthroat trout were at one time the most widely dispersed and abundant trout species in North America. In a more famous water than this, Yellowstone Lake, they probably numbered about 2 million. And the whole ecosystem in Yellowstone Lake centered around cutthroat trout. Because like the salmon of the Pacific, the cutthroat trout in this lake would spawn up every single little stream that flowed into the lake. And the grizzly bears of Yellowstone would feast on those cutthroat in the same way that the brown bears would feast on the huge spawning salmon in Alaska. There are park rangers in Yellowstone who have set up cameras and caught the bears feeding on those. It looked just like a salmon stream, except they're cutthroat trout. The sad part of the story is about 30 years ago, somehow someone illegally dumped lake trout into Yellowstone Lake. Someone who apparently thinks that lake trout are more fun to catch than cutthroat trout as they get bigger. Within a decade or so, the lake trout had, their population had exploded because it turns out that one of the favorite food of lake trout is cutthroat trout. And one lake trout eat about 40 cutthroat trout per year. So within a couple decades, the population of cutthroat trout had been decimated, had dropped by 90%. Now that's invisible to most people, and you might think, well, maybe it's just the anglers or the fishermen who care. But the ramifications of the invasive lake trout on the decimation of the cutthroat trout spread through the whole glacier ecosystem. So there was a 95% collapse in the osprey population. 20 years ago, there were 65 known nesting pairs of osprey. At the last count, there were 3 nesting pairs left, because their favorite food is cutthroat trout. Cutthroat trout swim in the shallow waters and spawn up the shallow rivers, and they are available as nutrients. Lake trout live in the deep waters, and they are not available as nutrients to all these animals. So the osprey disappeared. The bald eagles are much better hunters. They're more generalists than osprey. Their favorite food is fish, but they will eat anything else if they can get it. So when the cutthroat trout disappeared, the osprey disappeared, but the bald eagle just started feasting on other things. And their favorite prey became the cygnets of trumpeter swans, and Yellowstone Lake was the only place outside the Arctic where trumpeter swans would live in the summer, and white pelicans, which also lived in the park. And for the last few years, the trumpeter swan population has completely collapsed there as well. So I think last year there was not a single successful nesting pair of swans. So just to give you an idea, I know that's a sad story, but we'll tell lots of happy stories and see lots of pictures, but I want to give you an idea when I speak about these native fish and the impacts of them. It's much more than the sort of the imagination or the longing of an angler to catch a beautiful fish. These are at the heart of the whole ecosystem out there. So let's move on down to where that story actually took place. If we move down from Triple Divide Pass, we move down the Columbia River watershed, we fly over Lake McDonald where my lodge was, into this little pond. Kind of a marshy backwater pond. If I saw that pond in Vermont, I probably would not think of it as a trout pond. I think it was a nice little bass or panfish pond. Of course, the background where the water comes from, flowing off these glaciers and the melting snowpack, makes it a beautiful cold water. And there's 2 of these ponds, lakes, Howe Lake. The lower one, lovingly called Lower Howe Lake, is dammed up by a beaver dam. And so that's where I went, hiked up in there, and that water that you see below that beaver dam is the water where all those dozens and dozens and dozens of gorgeous west slope cutthroat trout were sitting. So the water was high, it's springtime, this is about June 5th. So I'm kind of wading down to the flooding marsh grasses and just kind of sticking my camera in the water, and at first just hoping I'd get something, but as I got a little quieter and was able to sneak in, I could see the fish and aim the camera. The backdrop was really hard to ignore at times. So, you know, this is one of those scenes. This was my first full day at Glacier, and what I did that day, I kept doing the whole week. Like I'd see this beautiful background, I'd take out my camera and take like 10 pictures, all of which looked the same. But it was so beautiful, I'd have to keep taking pictures. And then I'd put my camera away, and I would take more pictures of fish with my underwater camera, and then I'd look and say, oh wow, that's really beautiful. And I'd take my camera and take the same picture about 10 more times. Nice quiet water. I hiked up in there a couple times, never saw anybody else in there except these people. And I really like this one below because I don't know if you just saw that quick glimpse there, but it had a starred eye. But that one right there is the one I really wanted to show you, because you see the classic cutthroat trout spawning colors of a male, the bright red belly, and the slash below the jaws, which give it the name cutthroat trout. It's like a beautiful little, they're all wearing this beautiful little red necklace. And then the males have the red going all the way down the side. There are actually 14 to 18, depending on which biologist you listen to, different subspecies of cutthroat trout. So, yes?
Was it buggy that time of year when you were there?
Mosquitoes came out in the evening, my first day. So the person I was with said, oh, you know, it'll be mosquito time. So it was covered with mosquito repellent clothing. And there was not a single mosquito. I took off my shirt, I was in my t-shirt, not a single mosquito to bother me all afternoon. Just about sunset, they came out by the tens of thousands, and I couldn't get back to my car quick enough. Yeah, and I think the next time I went back, it was rainy and a little more buggy. But at dusk, it gets really bad. But during the day, except once or twice when we were in thick woods, it wasn't horrible. Cutthroat trout probably, the rainbow cutthroat trout species probably evolved about 2 million years ago. And a few 100,000 years ago, there seems to have been an event where there was a gene splitting, and cutthroat trout gained 6 extra chromosomes, making them, so they weren't part of the rainbow trout family, making them a more genetically diverse species than rainbow trout. As a more genetically diverse species, they are also able, or a more genetically complex species, they're also able to adapt to very local microsystems. So within a very short geological time, by which I'm talking roughly 15,000 years, they had gone from one species to probably 15 or 16, 18 different subspecies that are genetically identifiable through DNA. They're also actually, you can distinguish them by colors of spot, by patterns of spots, and by colors. And so you can tell the difference between a westslope cutthroat trout and a Colorado River cutthroat trout and a Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and my favorite, the Snake River fine spotted cutthroat trout. But what that means is that genetic diversity is really important. They are finely adapted, not just to a lake, but they will be finely adapted even to one little river system within a lake. So the genes and adaptations of the cutthroat trout that swim into one river in Yellowstone Lake might be different than the ones that swim into another river, which becomes really important because in one river they may need to spawn on the first week of July because of when the high water is, and just 10 miles away they may need to spawn in mid-June because there'll be big differences in water temperature and water flow. So it's a very complex species and very important. That's part of the story that we have to come back to. He and his wife, or she and her husband, I'm not quite sure which, but they came out very late in the day, and I spent another 20 minutes just taking pictures as, I don't know, like if he was trying to call his partner in for a free meal or warn his partner to stay away or was just showing off for me, but I spent 20 minutes just swimming back and forth, like splashing and warning me, even though I wasn't leaving. But there's another quick look. I did, after about 30 minutes of getting pictures of trout with my video camera, I decided I should probably get a few with the old-fashioned favorite way of getting trout photos, and I finally pulled out my fly rod and landed one so I could get a nice picture to show you that characteristic cut right there that gives the cutthroat trout its name. That just beautiful little bling that it wears around the little necklace. So just keep that in mind for some later pictures as we look around. That was mosquito hour. But that picture also tells us not just how beautiful the sunsets were, but something else. I don't know what those trees tell you.
Fire.
Yeah, so this was about, I think, 15 years after the Boy Scout fire. But the whole ridge that lake is on, about a month after I left Glacier National Park burned. So there were 2 huge fires the summer after I left, and one of them was on Howe Ridge, the ridge above Howe Lake. So there's signs, old signs of fire all along, and it does seem to be getting worse. The fire seasons that are getting longer and more extreme and more intense and more frequent. So one of the aspects of how climate change is impacting the park. So a couple more stories now and connect what happened at Yellowstone Lake with what happened at Glacier National Park. Here's just a quick little map. And I don't know if you can see my arrow, but this is Lake McDonald, where I was staying. This lake here is Flathead Lake, and Flathead Lake is the ocean to many of these cutthroat trout. It's the big body of water that many of them will return to and then spawn up from. So Flathead River comes up out of Flathead Lake through Columbia Falls and gets up to about here, and then it splits in 3 branches. So the south branch comes in, and this is a natural lake. That is an artificial lake. It's Hungry Horse Reservoir, I think put in about 80 years ago. And that dams the South Fork. So the bad news is that it cuts off the migration of fish in and out of that stretch of river. It turns out that as bad as that is, that reservoir probably may end up saving the species of trout, which I'll explain in a minute. The Middle Fork comes up this highway and follows this highway all the way up. So you can see this is the South Fork, the Middle Fork comes up along that valley, and the North Fork follows that valley. And I'll show you in a minute sort of a more 3D view, but all along that valley are these long, narrow lakes, anywhere from 3 or 4 miles long to 12 to 14 miles long. Narrow with steep, steep ridges on each side. Absolutely gorgeous lakes. Every one of them you look up and you see the snow-covered peaks behind them. All of which are connected by 3 or 4 miles of river down into the major North Fork of the Flathead. There are 2 major species of native trout that would have inhabited there that would have used that river as their corridor. So one I've already mentioned is the westslope cutthroat trout. The other trout is one that a lot of New Englanders haven't heard of, which is the bull trout. Any of you heard of bull trout? Yeah. Bull trout are close cousins to brook trout. They're in the char genus. And their actual coloring is a lot like brook trout, except they don't have quite the same bright red spots. But they are top-end predators. So they typically grow to 3 feet long or 40 inches long, and that's bigger than any brook trout I've ever seen in my life, feeding on little cutthroat trout. So they would have spawned from Flathead Lake 80 to 90 miles all the way up this river, almost to the Canadian border. And there were 12 lakes in here that had native populations of bull trout. 12 lakes in the West Slope. And all of that water had cutthroat trout. There's a quick look from early one morning in my first drive up to the northern part of the park, what that North Fork of the Flathead looks like from the only kind of the one major bridge and entrance into the park from that side. Again, all those peaks are part of Glacier National Park. And all of them have these lakes that flow down in. So again, here's a quick sort of aerial view, beginning from Flathead Lake, as you fly up that river system and kind of just drop into one lake after another. You get a sense for how long the lakes were, how steep the peaks are on either side, high gradient streams. Lower Quartz is one that I visited. Middle Quartz, I'm going to tell you a story about Middle Quartz. It's one of the hopeful stories that I'll tell in a few minutes, particularly about Quartz Lake and what's going on there to protect bull trout. I had a fun experience at Bowman Lake. Never got up to Kintla, almost on the Canadian border, but the stories at Kintla are very similar to the stories in these other lakes. So here's the main story. Here's the story that in some sense is being repeated here of what I told you more recently in Yellowstone Lake. So about 1900 or 1901, some European settlers to the area decide to stock lake trout in Flathead Lake. Could have been devastating. It certainly was devastating in Yellowstone. As I said, potentially, I mean, it's destroying the implanting of lake trout in that lake is destroying the whole Yellowstone ecosystem. And that is not an overstatement. When lake trout were put into Flathead Lake, however, the food for them wasn't as good, the habitat wasn't as good, and they actually didn't do very well. Their population was barely noticeable for 40 years, or actually for almost 100 years. So for the first 40 years, they were very rarely caught. They just sat there in the deep, continuing to exist, but not really a growing population. 40 years later, the cutthroat were still thriving, the bull trout were still the top predator in the lake. So people thought, well, maybe we can do something to improve our fishing, right? It's generally like, how can we make this better? By which people usually mean, how can I make it suit my needs more? So they introduced another species of fish into the lake, another non-native species. They introduced sockeye salmon. The same salmon that I showed you live in Alaska. Because they spawn up fresh water, because they're an anadromous fish, sockeye can live in fresh water. If you stock them in a freshwater stream, they will swim down trying to find the ocean. But if they eventually get into a big lake, particularly a big dammed lake, and they can't get out, they'll just adapt and start a population in that lake. And once they've adapted to fresh water, they are not called sockeye anymore, they're just called kokanee salmon. So sockeye were planted, and that turned out to be a success story from a commercial point of view. The sockeye population exploded. They began to spawn up all these rivers just like they do in Alaska. So there are pictures of sockeye salmon coming into Glacier National Park as thickly as we just saw them in Alaska. They didn't destroy the cutthroat. Their sockeye salmon are not primarily predators on fish. They actually eat zooplankton. So they actually didn't destroy the cutthroat population. So probably not a great thing environmentally, but not totally destructive. But a few years later, the tinkering continued, and the next step was, well, maybe we can make the sockeye salmon fishing even better by stocking non-native shrimp in the lake as food for the sockeye salmon. Bad idea. It turns out that shrimp are competitors with salmon because shrimp also eat zooplankton. Not only that, but the species of shrimp they stocked to feed the salmon actually are nocturnal. During the day they go down deep, and they only come up at night to feed when the salmon are inactive. So not only did it not provide a food supply for the salmon, but it was a competitor for the salmon, and the population of salmon collapsed. But because the shrimp are nocturnal feeders and go down deep during the day, the lake trout, which for 80 years had been dormant, all of a sudden exploded. And the population of lake trout bloomed, they overpopulated the lake, they had no place to go, and that whole highway, which for centuries had been the spawning lanes for cutthroat trout and bull trout, became the invasive highway. And the lake trout got into 9 of the 12 lakes in Glacier National Park. And 8 of those 9, the bull trout are now extinct, because the lake trout destroyed the bull trout population. But there are fun stories. I got to spend a day up in a couple of these lakes. My first week at Glacier National Park, I showed up to give a talk at the park headquarters, mostly to the staff. There's about 30 staff. And after my talk, and I explained what I was doing there, and I read some of my writing, at the end of my talk, a hand shot up in the back of the room and said, just want you to know, I grew up in Middlebury, Vermont, and my father reads your stories and he sends them to me regularly. Do you want to go canoeing and fishing with me? So I met John Sabalos, one of the rangers at Glacier National Park. Turns out he lived just a few blocks down from where I live on South Street. And we had a wonderful day hanging out together at Bowman Lake. Although we did stop right behind these pickup trucks at a little bakery out in the middle of no place. It has these absolutely wonderful bear claws, which I'd never heard of before, but now that I've heard of them, it's worth going back to Glacier National Park just for the bear claws. Think haymaker buns, but a little bigger. So I got to spend a day on Bowman Lake late in the evening into dusk with, there's John. So it was kind of fun to go out in the middle of Montana and Glacier National Park and meet someone who was born and grew up in Middlebury. I don't know, any of you know the family? Also got to spend some time fishing, and that was one of the fish that I caught. And there's another look at him. A little bit of a cutthroat caught on it there. So the cutthroat genes are still doing okay. Unfortunately, rainbow trout have also been stocked in those rivers, and because they're genetically close enough to the cutthroat trout, they've begun to interbreed with the cutthroat trout. And they are less fit, so in every single measure of fitness, when the cutthroat trout genes mix with the rainbow trout genes, the cutthroat trout genes don't survive and do as well. So the population's declined. It was my favorite hiking partner. And you asked about the mosquitoes. That was one of the few days where they were really, really intense. And the only place we could escape them was sitting out on that little footbridge with the breeze blowing up the river. So just another quick view of the North Fork of the river, and then I think we'll shift. But this gives you a sense of what those fish are migrating up. This was the, if you will, the highway of invasion. So this is what the rainbow trout, what the lake trout and rainbow trout would migrate up and invade all these little waters. Some of these little streams that come in are very high gradient, and the biologists that I talked to actually thought the lake trout in some of these lakes would be safe because the water is so steep that even though cutthroat trout will go in the water, lake trout, which are not typically river-dwelling fish, they thought wouldn't make it up. Unfortunately, just a few years ago, I think 6 years ago, one of the lakes they thought was free of lake trout, Lower Quartz, was discovered to have lake trout in it. So very quickly, the biologists started building a barrier, a dam, at the tail end, a natural dam of rock and logs at the tail end of Upper Quartz Lake in hopes that they could keep the lake trout out of it. The dam wasn't even completely finished when they discovered the first lake trout in it. Bull trout had already been wiped out from 8 of the 10 lakes. Because they thought they caught the lake trout in this lake fairly early, they thought they could save it. So the biologists had a very innovative plan. They went out angling, fishing in the traditional way. They caught 100 lake trout, and they radio tagged all of them. And then let them go. Which may seem counterintuitive if you're trying to get rid of lake trout, to catch 100 and let them go. Then that fall, during spawning season, they tracked the radio transmitters, and they found out that essentially every single one of them was in the same place. So there's only one place on the whole lake that was a good breeding place for them. There was a steep landslide with all these boulders sitting about 80 feet down the lake that was a perfect spawning habitat. So they went in with gill nets, and they caught over 1,000 lake trout, including 93 of the 100 that they pit tagged, which suggests about a 93% success rate at getting rid of the lake trout out of the lake. And the nice thing about it is you can't just indiscriminately use gill nets to get rid of the lake trout, because you'll end up killing all the fish you're trying to protect. And if in order to get rid of lake trout to protect bull trout, you end up killing all the bull trout, it's a failed method. But by targeting that one spot in the lake, they were able to get rid of essentially almost all of the lake trout with almost no bycatch of the species they were trying to protect, the whitefish, the cutthroat trout, and the bull trout. So they repeated that for a couple of years, and they think they may have actually succeeded here. And that method now they may be able to use in some other places. So here's the outlet of that little creek, just to give a sense where the picture took place. And I'm going to go to one more set of stories, and I'm going to read a little bit and maybe take some questions. So I just wanted to give you an idea that some of my research methods were with a camera and with meeting with biologists and reading and writing, but every once in a while I like to use this research method to try to at least get photographs or see what was present. in the stream is my favorite research strategy. So now when I tell my kids I'm going out to do research, they immediately put that in air quotes. Oh yeah, Dad's going to do research for his writing. But I did actually get to go do some real research. Spent a day with one of the USGS biologists who had a bunch of students from Montana State University out there with them. And we spent a day tromping up this tiny little stream, electroshocking the water, and looking for previously pit-tagged fish, and registering and counting all of the fish that they caught and then releasing them, because it just temporarily stuns them. And then they're fine, they swim off. So we actually caught some fish that the previous fall they had pit-tagged, including one little bull trout. And I don't know if you can tell looking at it, it's fairly small, but how much it looks like a little Vermont, close cousin of the little Vermont trout. So I got to spend some time with some biologists, which was very interesting in hearing about them, and they're the ones from whom I learned, again, a lot of the research on how not only the strategies for protecting the trout, but on how when the rainbow trout, invasive rainbow trout genes get into the gene pool, how it significantly decreases the fitness, the survival fitness of that. One last little story before I get up high into the mountains and end this. I did spend a couple days on the middle fork of the Flathead. This comes down out of a gorgeous wilderness area, I think the largest contiguous wilderness area outside of Alaska in the United States, the Beartooth Wilderness. It's part of 2 different national forests, and it protects all the headwaters. So the water quality of this river is tremendously good, very protected watershed. So I was really surprised to read 2 years ago that it was listed by one magazine as one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the United States. And it said, how on earth? It's got better protection than almost any place else with this national forest designated wilderness. But there is an old railroad system that runs through it that carries several hundred freight cars of oil every day with really no regulation. So they don't use the new like double sealed oil cars. And it's a high avalanche area. So the fear is one major spill of that could wipe out generations of fish in this river as well. More of my research strategy. And that's the picture I was trying to get to. That's one of the fish I caught in that river. And if you look at it, there's no slash. This, although it may look a lot in other ways like a cutthroat trout, it is not a cutthroat trout. It is a rainbow. So most of the fish you catch in these rivers have a mix of their 2 genes, and it's harder and harder to find the native strain of cutthroat in there. Probably no cutthroat genes in this fish at all. And they're all self-reproducing. And the longer they're there, the more it weakens the native adapted strain. So lastly, last set of stories. I'm going to bring you from these big lakes higher up into the mountains, up to some small mountain lakes that I had a chance to visit. 3 of them. I hiked in, actually got into Snyder Lake on horseback because I wanted to bring in some filming equipment. On 2 other days, did a hiking trip up into Avalanche Lake, mostly for cameras. And then my very, very last day, made it all the way up into Hidden Lake. And one of the reasons these lakes are so important is they are all above high waterfalls and impassable barriers. And so these are places where the invasive fish have never reached. So in some sense, the hope of the survival of this species of westslope cutthroat may lay in these protected high mountain lakes above waterfalls where all the invasive fish can't get in. And the hope is that there'll never be an instance where some osprey catches a fish from lower down and accidentally drops it, because invasive plants and other things get carried that way as well. So again, my favorite travel partner and I spent a day. Our wrangler got a little upset when they realized how much film equipment or video equipment I wanted to bring up into the mountains. We got up to about that point, and the whole trail was completely dug up, and we're sitting there looking, what happened to the trail? Like, did some delinquents come up here with shovels and try to steal plants? And he said, oh no, a grizzly was just there rooting around. And we apparently just missed it. On the way back down, like everyone on the trail had turned around and gone back because this grizzly had come wandering down the trail. So I don't know how we somehow missed it, but it may have sensed the horses. We're not big fans of horses, and left. But this one little Snyder Lake surrounded by little waterfalls, all pouring down into the stream, and walking along the shore, you could look down into the water. And at the right angle, when the glare wasn't bad, little cutthroat trout all over the lake. And again, above some high waterfalls. So this is one of the places where the kind of, if you will, the hope of the species rests in some of these high little waters. I stopped on another day with the camera at this little bridge, and was staring down the water, and I got down my belly and I was just looking down the water, and all of a sudden I saw some movement in there. I hadn't thought there was anything in there. And dropped the camera, found a way to strap my camera on a big long stick, dropped it down to the water, and managed to come up with some more evidence that even the stream still has some of these beautiful little cutthroat. Now, this is one of my favorite videos. Tiny little stream, only thigh deep, and I don't know if you can see it off in the lower left.
Yep.
Right there, do you see that? So it took a lot of footage to capture the occasional movement of the fish coming in there. I got better still photos than I did video. At one point, after videoing them for a while, I dangled a fly in the air over the water about 4 inches up, and both of them came out at the same time, hit the fly at the exact same time. So I don't know if they're siblings, but there's a sibling rivalry between them. There is. Avalanche Lake, another one of the lakes high up. Just stunningly beautiful. Hard to take your eyes off the waterfalls. Even when you're looking down at the water, it's hard to take your eyes off the waterfalls. But there you see, bringing one in order to get a photo, the very classic necklace of the cutthroat trout. And that strain, that gene pool still lives there. Very last morning, headed up to the pass. The road over the mountain was closed until my second to last day there. Second to last day of June is when the famous Going to the Sun road opened. So I got up at 3, drove to the top, was the first one in the parking lot. I was warned that the parking lot would be full by about 10. Wanted to get some morning footage of the sun rising up from the Atlantic Ocean side of things. But the other reason I was up there is there's a little creek right down the valley called Lunch Creek, and it flows off one of the last few glaciers left. They say all the glaciers in Glacier National Park will be gone in about 13 years from climate change. So Glacier National Park by 2030 won't have glaciers. There's a species of stonefly, 2 species of stonefly that live in Glacier National Park. One is called glacial stoneflies, and one is called meltwater stoneflies. The stonefly only lives downstream of a melting snowpack, a permanent snowpack, or a glacier. Most of the stoneflies I'm familiar with in Vermont are large predatory insects that eat smaller insects. But the stoneflies in this creek are so small they're hard to see with the naked eye. But they reach densities of 1,500 per square meter, but only within about 1 kilometer downstream of a melting glacier. And they are a keystone species in that they are what makes all the available nutrients and all the algae of these streams. They're able to munch on the algae, convert that into protein, that then everything higher up the food chain, the voles, the birds, The larger insects, the spiders, can then get the nutrients by eating the stoneflies, which eat the algae. The stoneflies, which only live in abundance within about a kilometer downstream of the melting glacier. This was one of the things I got up early to watch. Maybe one of the creatures that feeds. Oh, is that carrying through the speakers?
Yeah.
Anyone recognize what it is? I actually thought it was a chickadee at first. I thought it was a mountain chickadee. And I actually embarrassingly labeled it as that in one of my photos. But a mountain chickadee or black-capped chickadee would not actually have the white stripe on the top. And it is actually a white-capped sparrow, a song sparrow, and it's one of the most studied songs in North America is this, which I had no idea about until I found out I was wrong in labeling it a mountain chickadee. Because their songs vary from region to region. So here's apparently only the Glacier National Park version of them. Hiked over the snowpack after spending a few hours videoing and photographing. Hiked down into Hidden Lake. The last day of June, it was 90% under ice. Only one little outlet remained open water. So I did about a 3-mile hike, past some of the other famous residents of the park. Got down to the water. Was doing this for maybe 15 minutes. It turns out water that's 80% or 90% covered with ice is really cold. And I only lasted about 15 minutes. And what drove me out, though, wasn't the cold, but it was the appearance of this guy. Because the outlet of that lake is one of the spots, and this is my last slide, this is what ties this end of the story back with the beginning of the story. There are so many cutthroat trout spawning at the outlet of that lake every year that they actually have to close it to protect the bears from humans, because it's one of the places the bears sit and come and feed in numbers on the thick cutthroat trout schools. So sort of the closing picture, I'm standing in the stream, there's about 20 cutthroat trout in front of me, I'm hoping to catch one, I hear splashing coming up the stream, I'm thinking that is not a person. Turned and he was coming right up the stream towards me, and backed up to a tree about as far as I could get, and they got about as far as me from that wall there, and fortunately I had turned left and kind of looked at me and turned right. And wandered off. So I'm going to end there. Actually, I hope to do a little bit of reading, but from a short section of the book, if we have time, and then I can take some questions. Yes, I did want you to know that I wasn't just writing about fish and rivers. This is a quick section from one of the days, the only day I went over to the east side of the park. So I spent all my time on the west side, where the westslope cutthroat and the bull trout are. I've not spent any time in the eastern side of Glacier National Park during my residency. It is not merely that any trip to the east side and back requires several hours in a car, hours not spent writing. It's also the fish. Cutthroat, making their way up the Columbia River, colonized many waters on the western side thousands of years ago. The strain of westslope cutthroat has been lost through much of its native range, even in parts of Glacier National Park, such as the Flathead River system, where crossbreeding with non-native rainbow trout has diluted the cutthroat trout genes. What has come to light only recently through the work of scientists like Clint Mulfield is that genes of the Yellowstone cutthroat subspecies, a strain not native to Glacier National Park but introduced decades ago to a couple lakes, has spread far into the native westslope population. My last fish I caught there, high up in this mountain, is actually not a westslope cutthroat. It's a Yellowstone cutthroat trout, one of the lakes that dropped into them. So far, they don't think it's spread too far, but there's evidence that it's gone further than they thought. All right, so I began now to discover the east slope is just as magnificent as the west, with some subtle and not so subtle differences in character, based in part on the higher elevation and the drier climate. In the town of East Glacier, we turn north and follow Highway 49 around a steep, winding mountain slope, enjoying stunning views past fields of wildflowers and over lower Two Medicine Lake, back toward the park. We stop briefly to take in the view. Once driving, however, I'm more aware of the numerous windings of this road. As we go up, over, around, and down Two Medicine Ridge, we seem to be following the path of a spaghetti noodle through a plate of pasta. We turn onto US 89. It is wider and straighter, but even this route takes a big bend to circumnavigate a ridge. This surprises me. The ridge doesn't appear especially steep. I wonder that parts of the road were not carved in a more direct route. That flash of impatience, however, is only momentary. I am not in any hurry. The drive is beautiful. All of Highway 49 is itself a seasonal shortcut, saving us from heading all the way east to US 89 and Browning. Not for the last time, my thoughts turn back to Wendell Berry's essay and one of my favorite passages in it. And here's a passage from Wendell Berry that I quote. The difference between a path and a road is not only the obvious one. A path is little more than a habit that comes with knowledge of a place. It is a sort of ritual familiarity. It is a form of contact with the known landscape. It is not destructive. It is the perfect adaptation through experience and familiarity of movement to place. It obeys the natural contours. Such obstacles as it meets, it goes around. A road, on the other hand, even the most primitive road, embodies a resistance against the landscape. Its reason is not simply the necessity for movement, but haste. Its wish is to avoid contact with the landscape. It seeks so far as possible to go over the country rather than through it. Its aspiration, as we see clearly in the example of our modern freeways, is to be a bridge. Its tendency is to translate place into space in order to traverse it with the least effort. It is destructive, seeking to remove or destroy all obstacles in its way. End quote. I know this road is in some ways a scar in the hillside. I'm glad at least that it winds more like a path, more in obedience to the hill's contours. We wondered aloud whether the road was an old wagon path. I'm glad no highway designer blasted a straight route through the center of the hill. We will remain patient and delight in it. At the bottom of a long slope, a view opens up of a windy St. Mary Lake. This last ridge we wound over had another significance. Though less than an hour earlier we had crossed out of the Pacific watershed, we crossed another divide here, passing from the Gulf of Mexico into the Hudson Bay watershed that reaches to the very edge of the Arctic. In just an hour or so of mid-morning, we have driven beside waters from all three divides of this crown of the continent. Though we now look at some of the same peaks from the opposite side, we are just 36 miles away from my cabin if we had gone over the Going to the Sun Road. I'm still aware of the difference in landscape. We see forests dominated by deciduous aspens rather than cedar and hemlock. When the road winds around the east side of the hill, we catch glimpses of endless high prairie. And I appreciate Montana's claim to be big sky. We stop at the St. Mary's entrance and visitor center, and we spend time reading the words and thoughts of leaders of 3 different native peoples who used to roam freely on what is now Glacier National Park, hunting, fishing, and worshiping. These are peoples who are no longer free to use that land in the same way. Some of their words and thoughts will haunt me through the day. I am thankful to the park for its honesty in sharing the words. To say that I am glad for the existence of Glacier National Park would be a dramatic understatement. I have no doubt that I will be marked and shaped by this time I get to spend here, and will be forever grateful for it. Even apart from my own visit, I am glad for the work of conservation and preservation that goes on because of the park. I am also deeply saddened that the joy and delight of so many who visit here has come out of the pain and loss of peoples who once experienced that same delight and are now largely excluded from it. I wonder if and how it would be possible for the park to still be a national park without excluding those whose ancestors once dwelt here. Wendell Berry wrote of the same haunting. He said, quote, "I am forever being crept up on and newly startled by the realization that my people established themselves here by killing or driving out the original possessors, by the sense of the violence they have done to their own kind and to each other and to the earth." And I'll end with one of the quotes from one of the Kootenai elders that I read on the wall. In Glacier National Park, our elders are appreciative of a national desire to preserve the area in its pristine condition. We are thankful for the preservation of an area that has 500-year-old cedar trees who listened to their ancestors sing and dance long before the Kootenai were aware of Europeans. Yet we're also aware that this place has not been preserved because of its significance to us. It is preserved because of the many visitors that come to the area. So I'm going to end there. I sort of echo the words of that one of those elders. I think I was dramatically changed by the time in Glacier National Park, and I love the stories I heard. There were obviously sort of sad stories of the damage we've done, of the loss that may come from climate change, and yet there's so much beautiful and so much preservation there and so much hope as well. I mean, all the biologists I spoke to thought that it was one of the places that even in the midst of climate change, because the land is protected, they thought that the fish and the species there would actually be able to adapt. They may shift, they may move further up the mountains, but the biologists were very hopeful that the beauty and preservation of this place would remain. So thank you for listening to me ramble on, and I would be happy to take some questions. Yes?
Before you mentioned climate change, I was wondering, do they get a sufficient amount of snow every year to create glaciers?
I think we see more extreme patterns, more years of higher snowfall and more years with none at all. So what you get is sort of more of the extremes, more extreme heat in the summer, for example. Hence the longer fire season. Yeah.
Because of the fragility of the fish population,
Yeah.
where you are, is it all catch and release?
Westslope cutthroat the native species. Westslope is entirely catch and release. It's entirely catch and release for bull trout also. If you catch any of the invasive species like brook trout, which don't belong there, or lake trout, you are encouraged to keep them. In fact, in Yellowstone National Park, it's illegal to release a lake trout alive. Yeah. So if you don't want to keep it, you have to kill it before you can put it back in the water. Now, in some of the surrounding areas, so there are different rules. For example, Native peoples are allowed to continue to catch their traditional food of Westslope cutthroat. But most places, it's a protected species, and it's throughout Yellowstone. I mean, throughout Glacier National Park, cutthroat trout are protected, and bull trout are protected. Yeah.
On the honor system.
Actually, I did get stopped once by a park ranger who wanted to make sure I was fishing legally, that I had a license. He wanted to check my creel to make sure I wasn't catching anything. So I was actually very appreciative of that effort. Yeah.
Were you fly fishing?
I was fly fishing entirely, yes. Yeah.
And that feeds on to Woodington Park in the Canadian side, isn't it? Glacier National Park.
So it is a binational park. It's the only binational park. Glacier National Park is about 1 million acres. Waterton National Park is the Canadian side, is attached. But actually the rivers flow south.
Okay.
So the north branch or north fork of the Flathead actually comes south out of, on the west slope, flows south. Now if you go to the east slope, and then those rivers flow down eventually into the Saskatchewan River and out the Saskatchewan up into the Hudson Bay. It's believed that about 15,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, is when cutthroat trout managed to cross the divides. So all our colonization was up the Columbia River watershed, but there were a couple places where the little ponds that in high water could flow in both directions. And when the ice age ended, they got into these ponds and down the other side, and down to the Connecticut, down to the Colorado watershed and the Saskatchewan watershed. Yeah. So it's only about 15,000 years ago that most of the Rockies were colonized by cutthroat trout. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there a different taste to these fish?
I have So I'll be honest, I didn't keep any fish there. I happen to think brook trout are the best tasting trout. And I'm almost a Vermont snob on that. Like, I think brook trout are so good tasting that and maybe it's only because the rainbow trout in Vermont are almost always from a hatchery, and they always taste pale and pasty and soggy flesh to me. I have had been in rivers in the West where there was such an abundance you could keep them, and I've been on a camping trip where I've eaten them before. I think brook trout are better tasting. There's definitely a noticeable difference.
Isn't it partly their diet though? Like what fish eat that makes them taste differently?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that the diet impacts it somewhat, but the species impacts it too.
That's why we have sardines.
Yeah, I mean, whitefish live in these rivers, and the same rivers with cutthroat have pretty much the same diet, but it would be a very different tasting fish. Yeah.
So if the cutthroat didn't migrate after the ice age, what would have happened to the ecosystem?
Well, the whole ecosystem adapted over 15,000 years around the cutthroat trout. So the cutthroat trout filled all these niches, all of it. I mean, the prevailing understanding is, based on a lot of evidence, is that they came up the Columbia River system, up the Snake River, and about 15,000 years ago, they managed to cross one watershed down into the Colorado and colonized the Colorado. They crossed another watershed into the Yellowstone system, went all the way down the Yellowstone, then up all of its tributaries, and also got into the Saskatchewan system. They spent thousands of years populating, micro-adapting to little climates, and everything around them adapted to them. So, you know, the bears and the other thing came in, adapted to them, and by colonizing, they drove out other things as well. So,
In 15,000 years, this will rectify itself.
yeah, it's absolutely possible that in 15,000 years, everything will adapt to whatever. I mean, everything will adapt to whatever's there. The question is, what will that look like when everything adapts? And with climate change, the problem is that it's happening at so much faster rate than we've ever experienced, other than one cataclysmic event of the Earth being struck by an asteroid, but that wiped out essentially almost all life, or 85 or whatever it is, 90% of all life was wiped out when an asteroid hit the Earth and the temperature plummeted. So we're seeing a much more dramatic rise. So if it takes 100 or 200 or 15,000 years for everything to adapt, you may see a couple centuries of pretty bleak existence, right? And a lot of species may go extinct. Other species will arise. Some species will survive. Insects, tend to be species of insects that do pretty well. So we may have a world where cockroaches seem to be able to survive anything. So, world of cockroaches, lots of cutthroat cockroaches and rainbow cockroaches, and we have like lots of micro adaptations of them. No, I was very impressed with the work of the biologists, and they were, the work they're doing. Like, yeah, there's some lakes for which the bull trout are lost, but they've taken some pretty amazing efforts. So, one other story I didn't tell, but there's a high lake that was above a waterfalls that no trout had ever colonized. So some early settlers wanted to fish in the lake, and they brought Yellowstone cutthroat trout and put them in that lake, and they did really well. So there's already a non-native species of trout in the lake, but they didn't displace anything else. So in one of the last lakes where the bull trout were holding on, when they realized that they were almost completely wiped out, they caught the last 113 of them in the lake. It turns out they tested them genetically, and they probably all had the same parents. So there's like one breeding pair of bull trout left. So they caught the last 113, and they did something which is kind of risky and that some people question. They actually transplanted them up the mountain and dropped them in that other lake. And it's not like, so you might say, well, they're doing the same thing that we're warning other people about. They're introducing a non-native species into the lake. But the lake they introduced them into had already been stocked with a non-native species, and the very non-native species the bull trout need to feed on. So it was this desperate attempt to save the bull trout, and now they seem to be thriving in this high mountain lake. And the thing about it, it was only about 4 miles or 5 miles up a river from the lake where they removed them, but above an impassable barrier. So very close in climate and water conditions to the lake they left. So a very good chance that they should be able to thrive there. What that means is that they're ever able to then use that technique to get rid of the invasive lake trout, they actually have a population that they can bring back down and restock it. So you're talking about a very innovative way of rescuing a whole population from extinction. And there's so many little lakes, so that the westslope cutthroat and these little lakes are actually in really good shape. So there's a lot of great work being done. And there's almost no roads through Glacier. I don't know if you've ever been there. There's one road east to west. You have to leave the park to get to the north side. So it's really protected from development. And when they built the road, the Going to the Sun Road, the original designers really wanted to carve this massive road up it. And some other designers came along and they had a very, they only had 2 turns in the road. Or actually one major turn in the road. Because they were avoiding all the switchbacks that really were in the landscape. So even the Going to the Sun Road, the one paved road, was really well designed to have minimal impact on the landscape. It really is a protected wilderness. And it's really worth visiting. And the fish are really beautiful. Yeah.
So a lot of what you're talking about were sort of unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences of trying to engineer the system to meet our desires.
Right, and in terms of contemporary examples of
Yeah.
within the past 100 years or 50 years,
Sure.
what sort of unintended consequences are modern day biologists coming up with?
Well,
Are they making
I mean,
mistakes?
I think it's going to be might be some time before we begin to realize all the implications of the genetic engineering we're doing and all the new genes we're introducing into our system through agriculture. That's who knows? Will it be 10 years or 20 years, or will it take 40 years to see some of the unintended consequences? That's a really interesting question. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? No one wanted to know what flies I was using.
So I'm looking
Make them
not at the
yourself.
fish,
Yeah.
but at all the different varieties of stone. So this is a geology
Yeah.
question in terms of why so many different varieties. Is that just from the
I
glacier?
know. I didn't talk to
glacier
the.
depositing things?
Yeah, I didn't talk to any geologists. I talked to a lot of biologists with the USGS, but they're all biologists. That's a great question. We learned about some biology when I was at Glacier National Park for the month and the different uprisings of granite there, but I didn't really learn anything about the geology there. But you can see the different spot patterns on this cutthroat trout from all the other ones. Yes.
Since you brought it up, what flies were used?
You make them yourself.
The one bull trout I caught on an imitation brook trout streamer fly that I tied. Most of my fishing was, it was really cold. I mean, this was the first few days after when we first got there, the rivers looked like, my description was someone was making a kale smoothie and the blender was still on. So it was so turbulent, opaque, green water. So it wasn't really to the last week that these rivers were fishable. So I was fishing with some drifting little mayfly and stonefly nymphs along the bottom. But the one bull trout I caught was with an imitation cutthroat trout streamer. Bull trout's scientific name is Salvelinus confluentus. Salvelinus is the same as brook trout, which is Salvelinus fontinalis. Salvelinus confluentus gets their name as they're known for living at the confluences of rivers. And that's where they feed on other spawning species going by. And I actually caught my one bull trout right where the McDonald Creek flows into Middle Fork of the Flathead River. So that is perfectly named Salvelinus confulentus for where I caught it.
I've caught them in a lake in Idaho on a woolly bugger.
Yes. I've caught bull trout in Washington, Oregon, and one in Montana. And the ones I caught in Washington were on a woolly bugger, big black woolly bugger. Yeah.
Is that why you were casting downstream? Were you pulling a streamer through the water?
When I was casting downstream, was pulling a streamer through the water. I was standing above the confluence and trying to cast down and letting a fly drift right into where the two currents met, and that's right where it hit. Although, I'll end with this one fly fishing thing. That fish took me about 7 hours to catch. Partly because I was fishing with tiny flies and my glasses fell off my head and got lost somewhere on the gravel beside the lake. And by the time I found them, I'd have stepped on them. So there were about 10 of these trout feeding, and they were on the bottom, on the sandy bottom. And I could tell they were feeding because I could see them moving. But they were really crystal clear water and spooky, in part because there's bears wandering around, also trying to eat them. So every time I landed a fly on the water, they would just bolt. No matter how softly I landed on the fly, they would bolt and they wouldn't come back for 10 minutes. So after 5 hours, I like gave up, and then I found my glasses with a crack in them, put them on, I was able to tie another fly on. And I took my tiniest little nymph, and I cast it out, and I just let it sink. And then I stopped and waited. And I waited 5 minutes, and after about 5 minutes, they unspooked, and they came back. And I knew they were fishing on emerging flies, because they weren't hitting anything on the surface. They were sitting on the bottom, but they were clearly feeding. So when it came back, I just lifted it off the bottom, and I just let it sit for 5 minutes, and then it hammered them. And in 10 minutes, after 7 hours of not catching anything, in 10 minutes I caught 3, or 15 minutes, because I had to let it sit for 5 minutes each time. Landed them. So that was my success story, or it's a story of how foolish I was for 7 hours for not coming up with that technique earlier. After 15 minutes, I got out of the water, and I put my wool socks and my hiking boots on, and I fished from the shore. And I was looking for breaks in the trees so I could back cast like between the little gaps in the trees and get my fly out. And not all of my cast went in the gaps between the trees, which is why I needed the glasses to tie on the flies. So, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it.